The world is in the midst of a massive energy transition that I'm sure many of you have been witness to over the last several years. The globe is beginning to shift away from a heavy dependence on oil to more of a reliance on renewables. Let's start with the what of the energy transition. What do commentators mean when they say the world is transitioning to renewable sources of energy? Well, based on current projections, oil consumption is expected to peak within decades. At the same time, massive renewable energy projects are being built out across the world, and the purchasing of electric vehicles is skyrocketing. So we've established that the world is shifting to renewable energy. But what led to the rise of oil in the first place? What made it become so important? Well, there are several reasons. First, energy density. Oil is quite energy dense. It has more energy per unit of mass than coal or wood, which made it quite useful for powering engines in cars and ships, as well as machinery. Oil's adoption as the world's primary fuel was accelerated by the rise of the internal combustion engine, which uses liquid fuels like diesel and gasoline, both of which are derived from oil. It's easy to store and transport. It and its derivatives can be moved via vehicles, ships, and pipelines. Oil also turned out to be quite useful for more than ground transportation, or shipping, or even flying planes. By refining it, it can be separated into several fuels and chemicals, each with differing applications, ranging from powering planes, as I mentioned before, and cars, to creating plastics and fertilizer. Now, let's focus on the when of the energy transition. When did this transition begin? Arguably, the foundations for this transition were laid long ago, earlier than you might think. The first solar panels and wind turbines were made in the late 1800s, but these were not mature technologies. They were not as efficient and as powerful as the solar panels and wind turbines of today. But the real takeoff is much more recent and due to significant advances in key technologies like batteries and EVs, a related development. I'll discuss this in more detail later. Now, let's focus on the who of the energy transition. So, who will be impacted by this transition? Well, the whole world. A shift in energy this large won't have merely national or regional effects, it will reach the whole globe. But in particular, oil-rich states who will have to scramble to adapt or else get left behind in the new global energy landscape. States with large renewable energy production potential who will benefit from being able to produce abundant, cheap energy for themselves and possibly for export to other countries. Okay, let's look deeper at the potential impact on oil-rich states by starting with a bit of history. Many oil-rich states in the Middle East and some outside of it became quite geopolitically prominent because of oil. Countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iran benefited from having huge oil reserves that they could funnel into exports and crucially leverage for geopolitical power. Many of these oil-rich countries would come together to form OPEC, organizations of oil-rich countries that allowed its members to set oil prices favorable to them. As an aside, there are two OPECs. There's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. To understand how much power oil-rich states once wielded, and to a lesser extent still wield, let's take a look at the 1973 OPEC oil embargo. In 1973, OPEC, that is the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, imposed a full oil embargo against several countries, including the US, Japan, the Netherlands, and the UK. The effects of the embargo were significant in the US. Long lines were formed outside gas stations as gas was rationed out like food during the Great Depression. There were similar scenes in other countries. The oil embargo is one of the most famous examples of energy being used as a weapon. Interestingly, though, the United States has never heavily depended on Middle Eastern oil imports because oil from the Middle East has never been a large component of the US's overall oil consumption. Nevertheless, as I mentioned before, the embargo had a significant impact in the United States. Why was that the case? Well, oil prices are set within a global market, And by reducing oil production, Middle Eastern nations effectively increased prices worldwide, including in the United States. It's also crucial to remember that many U.S. allies were much more dependent on oil from the Middle East, so the U.S. had to care much more about it than it otherwise would. And it's also worth bearing in mind that oil is what economists call an inelastic good, which essentially means that unlike other products, it's not easy to replace in the short to medium term. If there's no oil around, you can't power your car by pouring water into the tank. So it's difficult to replace even if its price rises, people tend to have to buy it. Okay, the success of the embargo in terms of achieving its political objectives is still debated. Most scholars think it probably didn't. But in terms of its economic impact, the oil embargo really highlighted how powerful oil could be when it was weaponized. It was a powerful geopolitical tool. But thanks in large part to the ongoing transition away from oil, doing another embargo today would be much less likely to have as potent as an effect, and even less so in the future. It's also worth noting that the embargo helped set forces in motion that would over time make oil less important, because many of the affected countries poured money into researching and developing methods for energy independence, which included more investment in researching renewable sources of energy. Now, let's move on to the why of this energy transition. So, why is the transition away from oil to renewables accelerating? Well, it's due to several factors. Renewable energy technologies have gotten much cheaper. The cost of solar panels and batteries have fallen drastically over the years. China is another big factor. China has invested a ton in manufacturing renewable technologies, and by scaling production more than any other country, it has helped drive down costs a lot. And it's helping to spread these technologies via exporting them and investing in them abroad. Also, nations see an advantage in being less reliant on oil because most countries don't have huge oil reserves and thus have to be dependent on imports. So, many countries have strong incentives to adopt green technology. Okay, let's talk about a related phenomenon, the rise of electrification. First, electrification is just the conversion of a system or technology to the use of electricity. Why is oil and its derivatives being replaced by electricity and the renewables that increasingly generate it? Electricity based technologies are often better than their oil powered counterparts. For example, electric vehicles allow many people to charge their cars at home rather than having to go to a gas station, which is way more convenient. Improvements in battery technology are a key reason why electrification is taking off. Batteries have not just gotten cheaper, but more energy dense, meaning they store more electricity and are much faster at recharging than in the past, which is a big deal for new EV owners who no longer have to worry about range anxiety and no longer need to worry about waiting forever in their cars to recharge. Batteries and motors in EVs even allow drivers to generate a bit of charging via braking. Electric technologies are also often more efficient. For example, heat pumps are more efficient than gas powered home heaters. As I mentioned before, renewables, which were once expensive, have gotten much, much cheaper, and that has helped to incentivize their adoption perhaps more than anything else. Because EVs have less parts than gas cars, they are easier to maintain over time. Of course, environmental concerns are a factor as well. Electric technologies are generally better for the environment. It's crucial to keep in mind that there are three core technologies that underpin the shift to electrification. The first are chips or semiconductors. Second are batteries. And third, electric motors. A broad range of new technologies incorporate these components in some configuration. Think of the small drones that people increasingly use to film landscapes or aerial shots of areas. Those are made of motors for the propellers, use batteries to power them, and use chips to help them fly well, among other things. But electric vehicles are made up of the same basic components: electric motors for the wheels and driving, semiconductors for processing information from all the car's sensors, and the battery for powering the car. There are other parts, of course, but these are the core or key components. Okay, let's complete the discussion about China's role in this transition. So, to recap, China dominates in the production of a variety of renewable technologies, including solar, batteries, and wind turbines. It also dominates the production of rare earths, which are crucial for the creation of many of these technologies. I recently read an article which conveyed this quite well. Here's a quote, "In China, more wind turbines and solar panels were installed last year than in the rest of the world combined. And China's clean energy boom is going global. Chinese companies are building electric vehicle and battery factories in Brazil, Thailand, Morocco, Hungary, and beyond. Not only does China already dominate global manufacturing of solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, electric vehicles, and many other clean energy industries, but with each passing month, it is widening its technological lead." Unquote. As I touched on before, China dominates the production of rare earth minerals. Rare earths are not actually all that rare, despite their name. They're abundant in the Earth's crust, but they're called rare because of how difficult they are to extract. It requires some complicated chemical processes, and in the past it was known for being very polluting, so it became unpopular to do so in many countries, and China ended up taking up the role, and consequently it dominates that field today. Rare earths are crucial for the development of a wide variety of electronics, from LEDs to smartphones to computers, and of course, electric vehicles and wind turbines. China's dominance in green tech and development will give it a lot of geopolitical influence. Many countries are already looking to China for green investment and development in large part because it's already so dominant in that field, and China has tons of capital and investment money to pour into foreign countries for these technologies. It's already building factories for some of these technologies abroad. I can't stress enough that it has no real competitors in this space. All other countries are lagging behind by quite a margin. Also, China has a strong incentive to excel in renewable energy production, so it can wean itself off its dependence on foreign oil, much of which comes from the regularly volatile Middle East. Previously, I chose to focus on renewable energy technologies that were directly electric based. Both wind turbines and solar convert sunshine and wind directly into electricity. But natural gas is worth mentioning because even though it is not a renewable energy source itself, it's a significant part of the story of the energy transition. It was once considered a waste product. In the past, it was burned off whenever oil was being drilled for, but it's now an energy source in its own right. Crucially, it emits less CO2 than oil, and as a result, a large part of the decline in CO2 emissions from countries like the US have come from switching from burning dirtier fuels to burning natural gas. A big complaint about renewable energy sources like solar and wind is that they are intermittent. Improvements in battery technology are helping to iron that out, but in the meantime, natural gas helps to fill in the gap because its conversion to electricity can be easily ramped up, making it especially useful for when the electric grid is being used intensively. For these and other reasons, natural gas is often thought of as a decent partner fuel for renewables, perhaps a bridge fuel or one that will help with the transition. A major technological development that has helped natural gas production and export take off was the conversion of it into a liquid. Scientists figured out that you could cool it down by a lot and then it would condense into a liquid, and in that form it could be shipped, which made it much easier to handle. So I touched on China's role in this transition, but what about the world's other superpower? What is the US up to in this transition? And the short answer is that it's complicated. The long answer is that it's really complicated. See, the US invented many of the technologies that are driving this transition, but it did not scale them as China currently is through its massive manufacturing efforts. This transition contains some major paradoxes. China is the world's largest polluter in terms of CO2 emissions, but it's also the world's largest producer of green tech. Likewise, the US invented or helped invent a host of the technologies driving the current transition, like solar and nuclear, but it is not leading the effort to roll them out. Other than its claim to inventing these technologies, the US's biggest contribution to this transition might result from the Shale Revolution, which has led to the US becoming the world's largest natural gas producer. which, as I mentioned before, many experts view as an imperfect but nonetheless complementary fuel for the energy transition. Since I mentioned it before, let's take a brief look at the Shale Revolution. Believe it or not, in the distant past, the U.S. was the world's largest oil producer. Exploration and drilling for oil began in the U.S. as early as the late 1800s. But after years of leading the world in production, the wells began to run dry and the U.S. began to import more and more oil, often mostly from countries within the Americas like Canada or Venezuela. But it imported some of its oil from the Middle East as well. But starting around the late 2000s and early 2010s, a new crop of technologies allowed the U.S. to rapidly increase oil production again. By the late 2010s, the U.S. became the world's largest oil producer once more, and this time it also massively increased its natural gas output, and as a result became the world's largest natural gas producer. We can't know for sure in advance which countries will lose out in this transition, but here's a reasonable guess. The oil-rich countries of today that are heavily economically reliant on oil production and exports will have a harder time adjusting to a global energy landscape that will eventually no longer be as reliant on oil as it is today. These include countries like Russia and Saudi Arabia. Some of them may manage the transition. In fact, some are making strides in that direction. But it is difficult. Let's take a look at countries who are racing to adapt to this emerging energy landscape. Dubai, a city in the United Arab Emirates, which is sometimes confused for Dubai, has spent decades diversifying its economy in part to prepare for this transition. It started out as being heavily dependent on oil production, and remains so to a significant degree, but it has moved into other industries like tourism, being a transshipment and logistics hub, and a bit of financialization. Australia is a potential winner in this transition. It's a country with a huge, sparsely populated landmass that gets lots of sunshine, and so it has tons of solar energy production potential, and because its population is so small, its energy needs would be exceeded by its renewable energy production potential, which makes exporting that energy a wise approach. In recent years, there was talk of building a huge solar farm in Australia that would export electricity via a massive power line to Singapore. The project has run into some hiccups, but whatever happens next, the theory of the case remains sound. Australia and countries like it have the ingredients to be massive renewable energy exporters. The decentralization of energy production, driven by the spread of renewables, will lessen the influence of oil-rich states like the OPEC countries, at least on the basis of oil. These countries might find a new basis to maintain or increase their geopolitical influence on, but it won't be an easy pivot. We are already and will likely see the rise of green energy powers. China is the leading example of this, as it is the country most responsible for rolling out the energy transition via exports of various renewable technologies and investments. There may be less commitment to the Middle East by outside powers going forward. Maybe. Oil has been one of the biggest, if not the biggest, factors that drew outside powers into the Middle East. But it's reasonable to expect that interest to decline as future use of oil declines. However, oil has never been the only reason why outside powers are involved in the Middle East, so it is possible they will find other reasons to stay. The rise of new technologies might lead to the export of energy from different areas via battery tankers or through the use of green energy to create fuels like synthetic natural gas. Some companies are already experimenting with these ideas. These are new technologies at the moment and thus need to prove themselves in the marketplace, but they may prove to be viable in time, and if they do, they will allow many countries to use solar and the like to generate energy that they can export. In conclusion, the global shift away from oil for energy production and consumption will weaken the global influence of many of the current top oil producers. Energy production will be more decentralized. Some countries will benefit from exporting green energy and may gain some geopolitical influence as a result. We're in the midst of a major technological shift, much like the shift from using wood to using coal, or from using coal to using oil. This may not be on the same order of magnitude, but it is significant nonetheless. If you like this video, please like and subscribe and feel free to leave a comment. There's more on the way. Thank you.